sort of big, fancy, well, not so fancy, but nicely kept house with a yard and that sort of stuff, and knocking on the door. And the polite people just said they didn't want to talk, that we were outside agitators or something or other like that. People who weren't quite so friendly would call us nigger lovers and shout and scream at us. So as I recall, we didn't do that more than a day or two to outreach the white community there.
And were there, when you were out in the black community, was there any resistance from the white community that, you know, maybe was running things in the plantations and things?
There was no acceptance, so whatever reaction there was negative. I think I may have told you before about a situation where my partner Jeff and I were starting to work on a plantation, and in those days they didn't cultivate cotton with mechanized equipment at all. It was all done by hand, planting and cutting out the weeds. And so there was a line of sharecroppers in a field using hoes to chop the cotton. Chop the cotton meant cut the weeds. And we approached them and tried to get them into a conversation about registering to vote. And each time we said something to them in a slightly different way, or a person in a different position in the line, they would look down and they would not acknowledge we were there. Our backs were to the road, to the dirt road behind us, which ran through the plantation. And so after a while we decided this wasn't going to go anywhere, and we turned around and saw the boss's truck sitting there on the road. And we realized that this was possibly going to be some trouble, so we didn't avoid it. We walked over to his truck, and it was a great big guy sitting in there with a shotgun and a rifle on a gun rack in the back, and his hand on the seat next to a .45 pistol. So there was a message there to start with. And he said the same sentence several times, which was, "Boys, y'all realize I can shoot you?" And he said, "Well, sir, we're here to try to convince these people it'd be a good idea to vote in the Constitution," and blah, blah, blah. And he said, "Boys, maybe you didn't hear me. Do you realize I can shoot you? It's my legal right to shoot you. You're trespassing on my land." And he didn't move his hand. I think we did that 3 times, and then we said, "Yes, sir, we're sure going to leave right now."
Did you ever go back to that plantation?
No.
No, okay.
Not during the day, no. We might have, I kind of think we ran into those people again one night at a church. Because there was a church just right on the edge of that plantation, so we might have seen them there.
They wouldn't have said,
I don't think so. I mean, technically, they had to have written permission to leave. I mean, this was not officially slavery, but even in those days, on that plantation, they were required to have a written slip from the boss saying they were allowed to leave the land. Now, whether that was always honored, I'm not sure, but we were told that.
Now, when you, who did you live with in Batesville? Where did you live?
We lived on a farm. The two of us, Jeff and I, lived on a farm outside of town. On the north side, it was a family called Thomas, and we lived there. It was a rather prosperous farm. It was prosperous even by standards of the white farmers.
But this was a black.
Yeah, Edward Thomas was perhaps the most successful black farmer, and he had quite a nice little house. I would say, I guess, 3-bedroom house with an inside bathroom, which was more than a lot of houses had, and he had 200 or 300 acres of land where he planted cotton and soybeans. He had a tractor. I think he might have had 2 tractors. So, yeah, he was doing pretty well, and we stayed with him. He was not like Mr. Miles. He wasn't an outspoken leader, but he was tough, and people did not come to his house to shoot at the house. Exactly why, I'm not sure. But
did you ever see any guns in the house that suggested he would shoot back, as it was not?
I don't think I did. At the Miles house, which was shot at often, before very long, there was a group of men who came at night, came around sunset, and they got up on the roof with shotguns and waited. And when anybody came by, they were prepared to shoot. And sometimes they did shoot.
As you went on in the summer, was it hard? Did it get harder to be in Mississippi or easier to be in Mississippi as July dragged on into August?
Oh, it got easier. I mean, the thing was, there, you know, for everybody, there's the part of what we were doing, and then the part of how this was being seen. By about the second or third week, as you know from your research, this had become national news. Pretty much, maybe not every night, but for a long time, close to every night, it was on the national news, often the lead story. The cover of Time magazine and Newsweek had pictures of Mississippi, of us.
Yeah.
So it became, in addition to the rest of it, very exciting. And we had the feeling that we were right in the middle of some very significant national historical event, which I don't think most of us really understood. I don't think anybody understood at the time, because no one knew exactly what was going to happen.
How big it was.
But in hindsight, it was a major turning point in U.S. history. So no, it was very exciting. I didn't want to leave. I had, in a way, unfortunately, won a National Science Foundation grant for the summer to do some research in Mexico, and so I had to leave for a period, and that was for various personal reasons having to do with my brothers who were going to go with me and so forth. But then I came back, and so and I wished I hadn't had the National Science Foundation grant, because I would have stayed.
So you came back and
Stayed for the rest of the time, pretty much, and then so I was not there the full time. And then I left and went back to college. I didn't.
Was it hard to go back to college?
Well, not completely, because at that point my expectations of what I was going to do had been completely changed by this. I was a pre-med student before, and I decided that being a doctor could not possibly be as important as this. So I decided to become a civil rights lawyer, and so thereafter I was very excited about being a civil rights lawyer. And I was going to come back and work with SNCC in Mississippi, doing more, and we would just have one more successful project after another. And then that didn't work out. By the time I got out of law school, SNCC had changed into largely black power organization. White people were not welcome. White lawyers were not going to be accepted into that, and the whole thing kind of fell apart. And for me, in that sense. But I did become a lawyer, and
Did you work in civil rights law for a while? Or?
No, I don't think we need to divert into that. But I worked overseas for 4 years and got married, and by the time I came back and could have done that,
The movement was
it wasn't impossible, but it would have been very difficult.
How do you think Freedom Summer changed you? Not one way, but other ways?
Well, I think it made me vastly more aware of race in the United States, and as time has gone by, more reflective on not just the black viewpoint on race, but the white viewpoint, and the extraordinary challenges of trying to make people understand how other people see the same facts, or are they the same facts? Would seem to be the same facts, but when perceived in a black Southern lens and a white Southern lens, just really don't seem to be the same facts.
How do you think Freedom Summer changed the country?
That's a really interesting question. There are a couple of papers and books that have been written about that. It had the effects that it's been written. I'm not sure this is true, literally true, but that without Freedom Summer, the Voting Rights Act of '65 wouldn't have happened. Now maybe it would have happened, but maybe not right then. But it clearly had a big effect. The national attention on the South became much more intense. There had been things in Alabama and Mississippi in '63. There were more in '65. But '64 really being on TV so many nights for the national viewer on the channel TV to see when those bodies were discovered in Philadelphia, and the pictures of them being pulled out of the ground, and I think that brought home to people in the North the idea, and people in the South. Mm-hmm. I think it could well be that more white people in the South didn't believe that was true either. They just, but seeing it happen, seeing the local law enforcement officers being forced to confront the fact of really what they had done, which they didn't ever admit. But so I think it made people begin to understand that this was a country no less racist and divided than apartheid South Africa or many other countries which we had condemned for racism. That perhaps the United States was, at least in many parts, were just as extreme, just as brutal and full of terror.
It was a long process of conversation.
Yeah.
Have you been back to Mississippi?
Yeah, a lot of times. I've been back most recently this summer for the 50th reunion. But I went back for 2 funerals, for a wedding, and even for my hobby that I had the National Science Foundation grant for is studying a group of insects. So I went back insect collecting. I love Mississippi.
What changes do you see?
What changes do I see? I don't think I'm really qualified to say. When we had the reunion, some black people said it had changed completely. And in a way, that's true. There are, the number of elected black officials in the state of Mississippi is greater than any other state, which is almost incomprehensible by 1964 standards. I mean, living representative. Yeah. So, but is it really deep down changed? Are white people not racist anymore? I don't know about that. That's a tricky question. Some of the most thoughtful people who were at the reunion said no. Others said yes, that there had been a change. Certainly superficially, and maybe not just superficially. It's hard to say. Yeah. When the first time I went back, I stayed with Robert Miles and his family again, and one day he had to go down to some land he owned where he had some pecan trees. So we got in his truck towing a trailer that was going to be used to haul something back. And we got down to the land, and he noticed that the rear wheel of the trailer had fallen off. So we had the wheel, but we didn't have the cotter pin to hold it onto the axle. So there we were on the side of the road, and he said we were going to look around and see if we could find a piece of wire or a nail or something we could use as a sort of a temporary cotter pin. And there we were, kind of crawling around the ground, looking for some wire. Along comes a big Cadillac car, and it's the sheriff. Now, I hadn't been...
What year, by the way?
This would have been probably, late 70s, probably. Okay. So maybe 12, 14 years later. So I remember thinking that we were going to be killed. And maybe I imagined this, but I think I went to Mr. Miles and shook his hand and said that it had been very nice knowing him. It was a great honor, and goodbye. Because we were way away from any settlement or anything. And he said, no, you don't understand. And so the sheriff got out of his car. He walked over to us. He stuck out his hand and shook Mr. Miles' hand and called him Mr. Miles, which before he would have called him boy or worse. And he shook hands. Mr. Miles, you having trouble? Anything I can do to help? Mr. Miles explained the problem. And the sheriff went to his car, opened his trunk, had a toolbox, and took out a cotter pin and brought it back and helped us put it in. So it had changed. Now at the wedding, one of the more bizarre things of going back was that the woman that was getting married was the granddaughter of the Thomas family where we had stayed. And we knew her as a 3-year-old. It was a 3 or 4-year-old. So now she's 19 or something and getting married. And most of the guests were her friends from college. And they asked us, and so there we were, maybe 3 or 4 white people in the middle of a black community center. As we got into conversations with the college students, they asked us what we were there for. And they didn't say, what are you white folks doing here? They just said, what brings you to Mississippi? And it was probable in those days anyway, it couldn't be relatives. So and we said, well, we were here in 1964 for the voter registration project. And I personally didn't run into anybody who knew what that meant. So that quickly there had been the development of denial about what had been the situation before, which is a common psychological phenomenon where people do not want to remember. Holocaust survivors don't want to talk about it. They don't want to remember it. And these kids' parents must have been in that same way, not wanting to tell them about it. I mean, why would you want to tell your kid that you were subject to being shot just for being black? So they didn't know, and it was that was disappointing, really, that they wouldn't have. And later things changed. Later, people became quite aware. This summer, in the reunion group were something like, I think, 600 students altogether from many states, and they were extremely well aware of the history.